Florid Counterpoint responses. As you can see, I had the Nude Jeppesen C major Cantus Firmus and the D Dorian Cantus Firmus, which was by Fuchs. And in this video, I'm going to review the major. Okay, so I didn't just do C major, but I did D major and F major, as you'll see. So first of all, here's the first response above D major. So as you can see, the cantus is written on the triple staff in like the alto range. And then with that, you can write the response above it in the soprano range. So that's what I did. And let's look at what I did. So I didn't start on the first beat, which is helpful for the counterpoint when you're trying to distinguish the two different melodies. You have the first one come in for 2 beats, and then the second one comes in, so it helps you distinguish it. On top of that, then it is suspended into the next measure, so not only do you hear it come in on the third beat after the 2 beats already, but then you hear it suspending into the next measure, giving a little more familiarity as the given melody is changing in a very stable rhythm, beat by beat. Of course, that's just the first measure there, or the second measure. But as it goes on, it helps that the bottom note is very stable, and then with that, it's a placeholder of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 beats each measure, and then you have certain things happening with the counterpoint that kind of differ from that, and they help that melody stick out as a contrapuntal melody. So you can see it's a third suspension, so it's consonant. With that, you don't need to resolve a consonant suspension. You can go anywhere from it. It just goes up in stepwise using 2 eighth notes. It goes through the 4th, the 5th. Of course, the 4th is a passing tone, and then the 5th is just consonant. Then you have the 6th interval going down to the 5th, so it ends on the 5th there. It's passing through the 6th, so you can look at that as part of the harmony or just a neighboring tone there, neighboring in between these 2 notes. So you can see some more interesting stuff happening now in the Florid responses to where there's a little more freedom. I'm using these 2 eighth notes to justify that I can have a passing note in between those. And then from there it goes to the 5th, but then you have a neighboring tone above that going back to the 5th after that. So you'll see some more things here where I'm doing more things like dissonances and certain things that I wouldn't really be doing before, but I'm justifying them as a dissonant device, or I'm justifying it somehow to where that's the reason why I'm using it. Moving on from there, we can see that a third is formed, 5th, a 6th going to an octave. So you might think, okay, there's a 5th, and then there's an octave. Do you want that? Well, it's not really a big deal, because you can see that the 5th is just passing stepwise to the 6th. It's going right into the 6th, and you hear that with your ears to where from the 5th, it's going stepwise away from it. So it's merging from that 5th to the 6th. Then that is going up a leap to the octave. So not really a big deal at all. And then from there you can see at the end of this you have a 5th as well. But the bottom voice is staying oblique, of course. So in comparison with that, it's just traveling in oblique motion. You can see that forms a 6th. Then you have, it goes down to a 5th, which then steps up a 3rd to a 7th. So like using a double neighboring tone where one of the neighboring tones is a consonant interval. So it's still double neighbor tone, and then that resolves, of course, down from that top neighbor tone to the 6th of where the note was being embellished. So basically this whole measure is embellishing that D note, and then it's going down, it's going C, E, and then it's going back to the D. The D is then suspended, so you furthermore have D going to the next measure for a beat and a half, to where then it's going up stepwise to the high point of the melody. So not a really leap up to the actual high point of the melody, but stepwise. So a little different. I wouldn't say that you should consider leaping up to the high point or anything like that as a rule. More so, you should consider it something that gives you a good motivation for a good interesting point in your basis of your melody. And I'm going to show you how you can actually turn this into real music in another video. Look out for that. That'll be very interesting. But basically, a rule that you should follow though is that when you do leap up to your high point, recovering from that, you should consider that a rule. So some things aren't really rules, they're more just suggestions. Just like doing a 4th species basis for the Florid counterpoint response, that's definitely not a rule, but that's a suggestion by Fuchs. And you can see I tried doing that for most of these. There's a few where I thought, what happens if I don't do that so much? And I think in maybe one or two of these, there's only like 3 suspensions or something, so I'll try to look for that. This one you can see a good amount of measures are missing suspensions. So let's count. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 suspensions, and there are 12 measures. So it's basically half suspensions. It's not majority, but it is half. And it does add to being helpful, like I was saying, to hear that contrapuntal melody stick out, but it also creates very nice moments. And if you start putting these into strings, you find that this sounds really nice when you start suspending notes and doing suspensions on string instruments. And that's what I'm going to go over in that video where I show you how to make this more musical. I'm going to show you how I started using these basic ideas to write a song. The next one's in D major. The last one was actually written on my 100 subscriber video where I talk about some things and I write that response to that given melody on that video. So here we have the same given melody, but this time the response is written below it. An interesting thing is that the given melody is in the treble staff, and I said it was in kind of like the alto range, so we wrote the soprano range above it, which is true, but where it is an interesting place, being right above middle C to where it's in the alto range, and it technically could also be in the soprano range. So we could look at this as in the soprano range, the lower section of the soprano range, and we can see this is obviously in the bass range, being 1 note above the lowest note of the cello's lowest string, the C string, which would be the lowest note of the cello, and also the double bass, which would be the same note, just an octave down. It'd be written the same, but you'd hear it transposed an octave down. So getting into this actually, we could see that, so we're writing in the bass range, we have the soprano range above it. With that, we try to stay within an octave, and it goes to the tenths, and it's not really a big deal. It can just cause some problems when you're trying to do something, especially like building 4-part harmony, and it really is just helpful when you stay within your lower top voice within an octave, and you can have that gap between the bass and the tenor more than an octave, but the top 3 voices are within an octave, and also the top voice compared to the other voices are also within an octave. Okay, just following that makes it a lot easier when you're writing it to be able to do the things you actually want to do. But if doing what you want to do includes these tenths, and as you can see the end has a 12th, well, maybe that's actually what you want to do. Just that it might make it a little more difficult when you're doing 4-part harmony versus just being like pieces of a puzzle that are fitting together. When you follow all the rules basically out of the book, as they say, basically how the book teaches it, if that's what you're doing, it makes it really easy, not only when you're writing stuff, but when you're putting stuff into different instruments. It just seems to work really well, harmonizing things together, and everything just seems to kind of work when you follow out of the book. But with that, things can just sound like everyone else. If you start writing certain contrapuntal melodies that just repeat in, let's say, left-handed piano, and the right-handed piano you have a dun-da-dun, 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 you start to do stuff like that, well, every musician from the probably Baroque era through the classical, even Romantic era, did that a lot. So that's a sound that a lot of people are used to. It's a device that a lot of people like to still do, but if you do it plainly just like that, it can just sound like, okay, this just sounds like you're copying Mozart or something like that. And of course, we want to develop our own voice here, so we can follow in the footsteps of people like Ravel, let's say, and his teacher, Florid, who are big proponents and inspirations of saying, you need to find your own voice in this music. And even with Ravel going as far as doing basically his own thing with a lot of his works. Okay, so now getting back into this, we see the 10th goes through a 9th, 8th, and then to a 3rd. So if we think about chord tones, we see that it's highlighting the 10th, which is like a compound 3rd. It's going through the 9th, and then it reaches an 8th. From the 8th, it leaps up to the 3rd, so there's that leap there. Then the leap is actually then suspended. So it's not just resolved right after, but it's held out. Suspended into the next measure, where then it goes up a step, and then goes down to where it is resolved, And as you can see furthermore, where it leaps up, it's a third, it gets suspended to where in the next measure it becomes a fourth, so a dissonance, to where it has to be resolved into the fifth on beat 3, which is the conventional thing that's taught. So that's basically the rules to where it's prepared on beat 3 of the previous measure. It goes through to beat 1 of the measure you're working with where it's suspended, and then it resolves on beat 3. And you can see we took advantage of that by doing an embellishment of 2 eighth notes on beat 2 to where it's still being suspended on beat 1, it's embellished on beat 2, the weak beat, and then beat 3, the strong beat again, then it's being resolved, which causes another suspension again. So originally, that would be a half note being suspended on beat 3 of the previous measure, and then it would be another half note on beats 1 and 2 of this measure, and then that would resolve down, since it's dissonant, on beat 3 and 4 to another half note. And you can see here that beats 1 and 2, instead of being a half note, are a quarter note with 2 eighth notes. It's the embellishment of the suspension, which I taught in my Florid Counterpoint video. So the fifth is then suspended into a sixth interval, which again being a sixth suspension, that can go anywhere, it doesn't need to resolve. So that goes down to a seventh, back up to a sixth. So what that's doing is it's creating a neighboring tone, and now the same note is being suspended again. So you can see that one note is being held out throughout this whole thing. The only thing that's happening with the seventh is that it's embellishing that one note. It's just decorating the note. And you can see that would be boring if that happened throughout the entire song, but it actually adds interest because we can see the melody is going up, it's moving a lot, it has a stable point, but then as it goes to this point, this is a 2 measure length spread out through 3 different measures basically, and it's highlighting that one note. So doing that is way different than what we were probably expecting to happen when we heard this in the beginning. So things like that add interest, add instability to the predictability when the listener is trying to listen, but it's also playing off the foundational original idea and doing things in the middle of that or reframing from that and holding things out, okay? So that creates a lot of interest. Furthermore, we move on from there. We have some eighth notes again. We can see that's a device used a lot. And the first time it was used as 2 notes. One was a passing tone, and the second time, as we talked about, it was a embellishment to the suspension. Here again, we can see it's also an embellishment to the suspension. One thing to pay attention to is that this is a 4/5 suspension. This is also another 4/5 suspension. And actually the only difference is it's literally 1 step down compared to before, so not much different. So something to pay attention to if you don't want stuff to be repeating, you may want to avoid stuff like this. But actually in a Florid Counterpoint response, having some more freedom, I actually want to add a little bit of maybe some motifs, which some people might say you don't want to do, but in this case, I want this to be a little musical, so I want a few things that kind of repeat. Like we can see here, the embellishment of the suspension happens 3 times throughout this. It becomes a small motif of this, but we can see that this entire response is not consisted of a bunch of elaborations of suspensions. It happens 3 times. So it's a familiar thing that happens 3 times. In this case, I think it's perfectly appropriate even for a counterpoint response to be using something kind of motivically like this, because again, it makes it that much more musical when the listener can hear something repeating, but it's also not repeating in a fashion that you'd expect. It's rather random. It happens in the 3rd bar, and then in the 5th bar, 2 measures apart, and then it happens in the 3rd to last bar, just randomly. So with that, it's definitely not something you're gonna expect. So you can see where it's playing off a few things. The motivity to where you have something familiar, making it more musical, but it's also using it carefully in a way to where it's not establishing something that is predictable. That's what we really want to avoid in these, is predictability. And funny enough, a lot of ways to get away from predictability is actually leading up to it than doing something different. So what you do a lot is you'll do something earlier in the song that will then start to repeat later, and you'll think, okay, I see what you're doing here. You're going to do this, and the listener knows what's going to happen, and you do something completely different. That's good because you're leading up to the predictability and you're steering away from it. It almost makes it more unpredictable because the listener is paying attention to the predictable part and they're thinking they're going to know what's going to happen, and you throw them off. So it's funny how predictability oftentimes is playing into what someone expects and doing something different. And to do that, you oftentimes need to lead into that predictability. So we can see that these dissonant suspensions are allowing us to do dissonances on the strong beat, and not only strong beat, but the first downbeat, beat 1 of each measure. So is there anything else that we can do to do a strong beat on beat 1? And yes, I actually made a video about this. I'll have it linked in the description. And what you do is you prolong a harmony. So if you have a harmony prolonged in one measure, then you can prolong the same harmony in the next measure, and you can start the strong beat on a dissonance. You can even do this multiple measures if you're prolonging the same harmony. To prolong the same harmony, though, the notes in the given melody and the counterpoint, all the notes that are happening in the music at the time, have to be in the harmony and justified as the harmony, in this case the chord that we're using. People might go further harmony into chordal harmony and things that branch away from your basic minor, major, and triad harmony and chord and seventh chord harmony. But I think for counterpoint and for starting off, it's really good to learn all the rules and then be able to break them with an understanding of how music works, of what people are going to expect. Like many jazz artists say, you have to learn all the rules just to figure out how to break all of them. And it's funny how classical and jazz musicians think pretty similarly through different perspectives and different executions of what they want their result of music to be, but they're thinking about harmony, they're thinking about chords, they're thinking about passing tones and justifying certain dissonances, and it's just a sort of different perspective. Even how a jazz musician will look at, let's say, a second inversion seventh chord, a jazz musician will call that probably a chord over another chord, versus a classical musician will call it a inverted seventh chord. So just certain things like that. I find it really interesting, but I would say with the jazz and classical, you have more in common than different. It's just seeing through different eyes, different perspectives. And of course, to swing or not to swing is the question there. With classical, you're not really swinging, and with jazz music, you have swing to it. Okay, so furthermore, getting into this, you see that dissonance, the fourth, is a suspension. Of course, it's being suspended on beat 1, which then I was saying it has to be resolved on beat 3. This is playing into that, and you see all that is happening. And as I kind of already mentioned, it's an elaboration of the suspension, with the third going back down to the fourth, which leads you to the fifth. So it's that nice stepwise motion after stepping up, down, down, and then down again to a sixth quarter note on beat 4, which is suspended into the next measure, beat 1, and you can see that's a ninth, so that's a dissonance. So that should be resolved on beat 3. So let's look, we have beat 2, and then we have beat 3, and we can see it is resolved. But I played into that by adding not only some eighth notes, but also 2 16th notes here to be able to do what I wanted to do with the intervals and also the fluency of the melody. So I wanted to go from here, up a little bit, down to the resolution on beat 3, and then go up to a sixth, which led me for a leap in my next measure, and adding these note durations allowed me to do that. We can see some dissonances. We can see the eighth goes to a ninth, which goes to a tenth, so we can see that's justified as a passing tone. We can see the 10th goes to a 9th to an 8th, another passing tone as a dissonance. 8th, 7th, 6th, another passing tone. We can see all the dissonances are justified somehow. And this is not just to pass a test, but it's a fact that a unjustified dissonance has a sound to it that you may not like. When you're writing your songs and you want things to sound nicely, using dissonances are great when they're justified. But when they're not, they can just stick out like a sore thumb, I think is what people say. It's just a random bump in the song that sounds like, ooh, did they mean to do that? But when it's justified, you hear the dissonance, and then it's being resolved or it's going into harmony somehow, and you think, wow, that sounded really nice, that was really interesting, maybe even dramatic. Okay, so it adds to an effect of the piece, but it's good to follow these rules, because without it, if you're just adding random notes, like you see a lot of people just hit their hands down on a piano, it doesn't sound very nice. So that's why it's good to follow the rules. It helps you understand, oh, that's why this sounds nice, that's why this doesn't sound nice. And of course you can branch away from the conventional approach and spice it up with your own voice. So we can see furthermore, this ends on a D, the sixth, which then leaps up to another D. So just an octave leap there, and then that is recovered down by a step, but then it goes up to the same D note, which is then suspended. So it's a longer note duration with the quarter note being compared to all the eighth notes and such leading up to that moment, but then it just dips down for a second just to be lengthened out another 3 beats. So you can see it's basically altogether about 5 beats that one D note is covering, so it's a pretty good slow steady moment at the top, which is what we were shooting for. And again, not a rule, just a suggestion, and from there you can see that it's suspended in the next measure, where from there it creates a third consonant suspension. You can go wherever it wants, it goes to a fourth, which then to a fifth, so dissonant passing tone, sixth, seventh, eighth, another dissonant passing tone with the seventh, and it's all going stepwise, leading you to a 10th in this measure, which then you have a dissonant ninth back to the 10th, so just a dissonant neighboring tone. And now we see same thing to where this note is now being basically held out 5 measures, and it's being suspended into the next measure where it creates a ninth, where then it has to of course be resolved on beat 3, which it is, but then it is elaborated with a note going up, back down to the suspended note, and then down to the resolution, of course creating that nice stepwise motion. And then you have a held out note, which is actually D, and since we're in D major, that's the tonic note, which was also the note chosen for the high point, so familiar note here, which then goes up a step, E, D, C, B, A, creating a 12th, so we're going far down from the top now, and you can see the root note of that, the bottom note of that is A, the 5th degree of the scale that we're using, creating a 5th, which allows the top voice to move down a step and allows the bottom voice to leap up a 4th from the 5th degree to the tonic. Since from the tonic up it's a 5th, from the 5th degree to the tonic it's a 4th, being that inverted 5th interval. So that's not the conventional approach going from the leading tone to the tonic, but what it is doing is it's creating a perfect cadence, which is something that you're going to want, especially let's say you're writing a sonata and you really want that perfect cadence at the end of your exposition. Here you have a perfect cadence instead of just a soft cadence where you have your leading tone going into your last note, which I'm calling it a soft cadence. That's not an actual terminology, but it's a softer feeling than the perfect cadence a lot, which is leaping into your final note. Okay, next we have F major. We can see right off the bat in the first measure, this one does something interesting. And again, being Florid Counterpoint, this one is kind of steering away from the rules that we were taught. It's still going to be using all the rules that were taught, but it's going to be doing some things that kind of play with those rules, bend them a little bit, but still stick with the same rules and kind of just bend them a little bit to create some interesting stuff that still is justified and still works because of that. So what we did here is instead of starting on beat 1, instead of starting on beat 3, either of the strong beats, we can see the counterpoint actually starts on beat 2 with an octave and then goes up to a 6th on beat 3. So definitely not a conventional approach and not an answer that you're going to see a lot of people doing, but this is creating a little more spice here and branching away from just doing things like everyone else would, which in result can create a little bit of a different sound. The 8th goes to a 6th, of course with the 3rd, that is suspended, which then since the given melody leaps up a third. That creates an octave in the next measure with that suspension. Of course, that can go wherever it wants to, and it goes up a seventh, sixth, and fifth. Dissonant passing tone of the seventh there, where the fifth is now suspended in the next measure, creating a sixth, where that goes down to a seventh, and then up to a fifth. So that third leap there of a seventh and a fifth, so you have a double neighboring tone, which then resolves down to the sixth, which is where the note started on, where the neighboring tone was creating the double neighboring tone from. So again, that's another embellishment of the same note. This whole measure is basically D with that double neighboring tone decorating it. We can see the stepwise descent of the melody from the beginning as it starts, and it slowly goes up, and then with that neighboring tone function, it goes down, up, back down. In the next measure, it's back down one step to an octave, so we can see that nice melodic fluency throughout the melody. The octave is just a half note, which uses two quarter notes to have a dissonant neighboring tone of a seventh, going to a sixth, which then back up a bit as we can see the melody from the neighboring tone goes up, down, and then it goes back up again, and now it's going back down in that next measure on that fifth, and furthermore, it's going down even more. Here it breaks away from the average pulse of the 1, 2, 3, 4 that the 4/4 measure creates on its own, and does a dotted quarter note. So a beat and a half, however you want to look at it, a quarter note plus an eighth note in length, which then following it is another quarter note. So if you think about beats, this covers beat 1.5. This is starting not on beat 2, but the second half of beat 2. If you think of your eighth notes as and, 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and, this would be the and of beat 2, but also the first half eighth note of beat 3, which then after that is another eighth note, so that fills in the second half of beat 3, and then it ends on a quarter note, so 4 beats. So it follows all the 4 beats, but having 1.5 beats, and then 1 beat, so you're already off kilter there, and then it brings it back with the eighth note, and then it ends on an actual duration on the 4th beat. So that definitely creates interest for the listener. Things like that really help for voice leading independence, because if you want the melody to stick out more, if you start to change it up and doing things that the listener's not going to expect, that's already going to stick out more to the listener. Then after it steps down, it leaps up a sixth to an F from A, where then it creates a sixth, which then that does the similar thing as the response before, to where it's recovered down a step, but then it goes right back up to the same note again. So with this, following these rules where you have a nice stable scale degree as well, when you're writing your own music and you're using these ideas, then it's very helpful, because you're going to leap up to a nice stable scale degree. From there, you're going to kind of hold it out a little bit, and these ideas can just help you when you're trying to think of writing a song, even just as a basic idea, which then you can go and edit later to make it sound more how you want it to sound. So then the conventional approach is, if you're holding out that note, then to go down from that note quite fast. And this kind of plays on that, to where you have an embellishment of the suspension, and it's doing the embellishment of the suspension on a consonant suspension. So in this case, this doesn't have to resolve down a step, but it is traveling down a step from a 5th interval to a 6th interval, where you have that embellishment kind of just playing off of that idea, but just a consonant suspension. That 6th suspends into the next measure, creating a 4th, where of course it's taught to then resolve that on beat 3, and we can see that follows this exactly. And this just does the same thing, where we have an embellishment of the suspension, where it goes up and then back down, leading us to a 6th interval, where that goes up a step to the next measure, where the given melody is also going up a step, so we just have a 6th and a 6th. Not parallel sixths, but consecutive sixths. You don't call it parallel intervals if they're not perfect intervals, because they might be major, they might be minor, and even if you do know that, it would just be better to call them consecutive. But when you have 2 perfect intervals, now it would be more proper to call those parallel. because in any circumstance you have two perfect intervals, they're always going to be parallel. You won't have to sit there and think about minor or major, in case you see the point. This travels up stepwise 5/4. This travels up stepwise with the intervals of a 6th, 5th, 4th, and 3rd, leaping down a 4th to a 6th, which is then suspended. But we can see something interesting with the rhythmic values of the notes chosen. So it starts on a dotted 8th note, which would be in duration an 8th note and a 16th note in length. So this is doing something similar to where it's throwing you off kilter, but instead of like the quarter note durations, this is throwing you off kilter in the 8th note durations. So now you have an 8th note and half an 8th note, or 16th note. That's throwing this off, but then you have another 8th note and another 8th note, so those are slightly off the beat, a 16th note off beat compared to how they normally would be, which then resolves rhythmically on the last note, which is a 16th note, filling in that gap, which then that goes down a 4th leap to that suspended note, creating that consonant suspension of a 5th, which we're going to see this does something interesting here. So we can see this sort of plays off the elaboration of the suspension idea to where originally we were going above the suspended note, back to the suspended note, and then that leads you to the resolution note. And we can see we're basically doing that, but we're just going one note below instead of one note above, and then we're going back to the suspended note. So that's sort of a variation on the original suspension. That's not what is taught as the elaboration of the suspension, but what is taught is instead going down from the suspended note one step, which would actually be the same note as your resolution note, and then from there going down another step on your 8th note, which then leads you back up to your resolution note. So that one is more of an elaboration on the resolution note, which hasn't happened yet. So you're anticipating the resolution before it actually happens with the embellishment. So again, it's not conventional. Florid counterpoint, kind of bending the rules just a little bit, but as you can see, it's not bending a whole lot. It's just using the other ideas to come up with some interest. A reason why you maybe wouldn't want to do this is because now I have the suspended note going down to the resolution note with an 8th note, going back to the suspended note with an 8th note, and then back down to the resolution note after that, and doing that all quickly and just filtering through those notes. Sometimes that doesn't sound very good, but in this case I actually like how this sounds in this circumstance. So a lot of things are in certain connotations and certain circumstances, but furthermore, what's the next note? A 4th being suspended. So that's not what we normally have. We normally have the opposite. But here's where I don't want to complicate things too much, but just think about this being two tied half notes. Okay, we're looking at this A in this measure, and if that was two tied half notes, we'd see that that would be suspending, okay, creating a 4th with this note, which we can think of this note as a dotted half note. Let's think of it maybe as a whole note, just 4 beats. Whatever it is, it's going to this next measure. It's going past this next beat. So sort of a backward suspension, if you think about it, because as this note is being held, it's creating that dissonance. This note's being, let's say, suspended into this note, which is then creating the suspension, and this note is just holding out in its duration. Then the given melody is resolving to the 5th. So a sort of backward suspension there, with the given melody creating the suspension and then resolving it. And with that, that might reach towards, not quite, but hint and get close to the grounds of metric modulation, to where you start playing around with the meter that the listener suspects, and instead of having a 4/4 beat, you start to do some other things. That's not quite doing it rhythmically, but is sort of doing it harmonically, to where it's using the meter of the whole note kind of as the thought process of a suspension, and flipping the suspended note of the counterpoint as the thought of kind of the given melody that you're working with. So you'll furthermore see where I break away from these exercises, start to write my own music and stuff like that, and teach you some cool things. I'm going to do a lot more stuff like that, to where it plays off rules and certain things that you're taught, but plays and, like I'm saying, bends the rules, and you come up with some really interesting results as the sound. And it becomes even more interesting when you start then adding this into different instruments. So what happens if I do a clarinet with a cello or something? Maybe not an average idea, but you know what happens? And then you think, oh my gosh, that actually sounds really cool. Okay, so we're going to the last. We had that fourth, which is kind of like a backward suspension leading into that fifth, resolving into that fifth, which then steps down to a sixth, fifth, and then fourth, third. So it's playing off that embellishment of the suspension, kind of using the idea. Of course, the fourth is a dissonant passing tone. And then that third is the leading tone, leading you up one semitone to the final note, which the given melody being G is scale degree 2. So you have scale degree 2 and scale degree 7, both one step away from your tonic note and scale degrees and the notes, which you can see that stepwise motion very nicely bring you into that final note. So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about. So where on the last one I was saying the perfect cadence is oftentimes what you want to establish at the end of, let's say, an exposition, also known as your medial caesura or your essential expositional closure. And that is basically to give you a solid feeling that the exposition has ended. This oftentimes is in the form of a codetta, which is a small coda. A coda that's big enough to end the exposition section of the sonata, of that movement, but not enough to actually tell you it's the ending of the movement. That would be the coda. So you could see where if, let's say you're using an idea like this, or maybe you're using this idea and you thought this sounds nice, let me put this into more instruments, make a variation of this idea, make it more musical, whatever you'd want to do, probably something along those terms. And let's say you'd want to use this as a second theme in a exposition section. In that case, this wouldn't have a very strong ending. It wouldn't be super clear to the listener that, okay, this is the very strong ending to this section of the movement. So that's where a codetta comes in. So where you don't need a codetta, but it is especially useful if you don't have a convincing ending of your second theme. With this, you can create a sort of another passage or a section that can build off material from your transition section, or can just be completely new material, oftentimes restating the first or second theme throughout it at some point, but then really giving you that final sense of closure. Okay, next response, another one in D major. We can see the given melody is this time written in the bass clef, in actually the bass range. The response is written in the treble clef in the soprano range. When you start to go up this high, you can definitely justify you're not going to be in the alto range. As you can see, this first note of the A starting here is very close to the next C an octave up from middle C. Okay, so this one's more conventional to where you just have on beat 3, the first note of the response, it creates a fifth. Of course, when you're writing above, you can do an octave or a fifth. It's debatable if you want to choose on a 10th, but that could be very useful if you're doing something like invertible counterpoint at the 10th, writing a fugue or canon or something, which is actually going to be my next video, invertible counterpoint. Look out for that. It'll include invertible counterpoint, the octave, 10th, and 12th. So first, before we look at the melody, let's look at the given melody and see that it leaps up a third from the first measure to the second measure. And with that, if I just went up a step like you might want to do or something, you'd actually be creating a fourth interval. So in this case, I actually leap up a fourth, as you can see, creating a sixth in the next measure, where it just goes stepwise using 2 eighth notes, where then it goes back up to a half note on C, to where those eighth notes were just going C, B, and then back up to C. So you can see that that fourth was basically used as a neighboring tone in the rhythm of 2 eighth notes. And not only is it on beat 2, which is a weak beat, but it's also on an eighth note of beat 2, so the and of beat 2, if you will, which is an even weaker moment of the meter. And of course, that's using a dissonance on that very weak part of the meter, so we can see where that's a very appropriate use for using eighth notes and the dissonance and everything else. The real question is, do you like the sound? Do you like the result? That's the biggest question. That fifth is suspended into a quarter note, creating a fourth, where that's suspended on beat 1, should be resolved on beat 3, and we can see that follows that exactly, with just the simple embellishment that I keep doing, one note above, back down to the suspended note. Using 2 eighth notes on beat 2, turning the suspended note into a quarter note, which was originally just a half note. Okay, and that all leads to the third, which is the half note, which then just goes up a step to a quarter note, creating another third in the next measure, because the given melody is, of course, moving up a step as well. So when you have an interval and you're going up a step or down a step, and your given melody is doing the same thing, going up or down a step with it, it's pretty obvious, but it's good to think about these things out loud, that will always create consecutive or parallel intervals. In the case if it was a fifth or an octave, it would be creating parallel fifths or parallel octaves no matter what. So even when things are obvious, it's rather good just to think about them. Then we can see some more dissonances in this measure and actually a voice crossing. So what happens is the third goes up to a fourth, back down to a third. We can see that neighboring tone function of the fourth. That's how that one's justified. Then the third goes to a 2, which goes to a unison, a 1. We can see that second is justified as a passing tone in between the third and the unison, which then the unison goes down a step to a quarter note on the last beat, which creates a brief voice crossing on the fourth beat of this measure. From that brief voice crossing, just one note below the given melody, then the given melody leaps down a third, while simultaneously the counterpoint goes up a step, creating a third interval uncrossing that crossed melody. But then it's very easy to tell that's what happened, because of course the given melody is going in each measure 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 in each measure. Well, we can see a lot of faster rhythm in the counterpoint, but also rhythmic variation, which helps it stick out. The third created then goes up through a fourth and a fifth. So those eighth notes and the quarter note are just helping this stick out more to the listener. And then also the notes chosen with that dissonant fourth that is being prepared properly. That allows the dissonance to be able to fit in there nicely without a problem. But then also using a dissonance adds to the overall voice leading, to where the best intervals for voice leading are actually your dissonances, but when they're used correctly. If you just use a bunch of dissonances, well, that probably still would be good for voice leading, but is it going to sound good? No. And this is where you have to think about what you're playing around with here is harmony. And when you're adding dissonances, those are non-harmonic devices. So those go outside the harmony. So you're not harmonizing anything in dissonances. You're creating unharmonic moments. And with this, when those unharmonic moments transition nicely into a harmonic moment, that's when you get these really nice sounding moments, because the dissonance merges into something that sounds rather beautiful instead of just a random note sticking out and then nothing happening to it. So just remember, when you're creating harmony, that's harmonic. When you're creating dissonances, that's not harmonics. You're not creating any harmony there. You could justify dissonances a lot as parts of chords as harmony, sure, but when you're using them as passing tones and neighboring tones and stuff like this is allowing you to branch out of the harmony that you're implying just to go back into it, basically. These dissonances are justified as notes that are in the middle of the notes in the harmony that you're using, basically. For the most part, that's what's happening here. Whether you're doing a passing tone, whether you're doing a neighboring tone or a dissonance, it's the same deal. We then see at the end of this measure a seventh. So of course a seventh is alright. So of course a seventh is fine if it's used as a passing tone, which we can see it's used as a passing tone here, and it's on the last beat of the measure. So in this case it's a quarter note, but even if it was a half note, then that's totally fine. And furthermore, getting into eighth notes, it's not what's taught in these exercises, but if you have an eighth note traveling in stepwise motion, ending on that dissonance, of course, if it's approached and left in opposite direction, just like a passing tone should be, then it's perfectly justifiable where it is, especially if it's occurring on a weak part of the measure. And as we should know, passing tones can occur on beats 2, 3, and 4. They just don't occur on beat 1 with a dissonance. That is, unless you're prolonging the harmony, which kind of gets into a little different territory, but it's just something good to know. But with that, you can get creative there to where if you're using eighth notes now in beats 2, 3, or 4, maybe even 16th notes, now you can do a lot more with that whole idea of being able to use those dissonances on those certain beats. For these exercises, what it's taught, you can do a neighboring tone as a quarter note on beat 2 or 3 in a 4/4 time signature, basically in those middle two beats, and not on the end beat. So of course, if we're in a 3/4 time signature, we could only do quarter note neighboring tones as beat 2, not the last beat. And then suspensions are taught to be used in a 4/4 time where you have beat 3, preparing the suspension as a half note, which then goes to the next measure as another half note on beats 1 and 2, which is the suspension. Then another half note on beat 3 and 4, resolving that suspension. Okay, but then with that, like what I've done, when you start to go into smaller note values, you can see it enables you to do a lot more, like with these neighboring tones that I'm doing, for example, with the eighth notes. Okay, then moving on, we see some interest in the rhythm again. We have an eighth note going to a quarter note, going to another eighth note, quarter note, quarter note. So again, we got to think about the fact that we're a half beat on this first one. The second note would be 1.5 beats. And then this third note would then connect the 1.5 beats to 2 beats. Now you're on beat 2, the ending of it at least. You have beat 3 and beat 4. But with that beginning eighth note, quarter note, and then eighth note again, that throws it off to where the next quarter notes sound a little bit unexpected, where then you can see this leads up to a D, which then leaps up to an A in the next measure. So of course that's an interval of a fifth. The D is a dotted half note. It was taught you can use a dotted half note with a quarter note in the same way that you'd use 2 half notes. So here I played off that and I did a dotted half note, but then in the next space I did 2 quarter notes because I wanted to resolve down from that high point. I also didn't want to suspend it. It didn't want to be suspended. I chose to go a 7th and a 6th using 2 eighth notes, which leads me to a dotted quarter note on the next measure with a 6th. Then you have a 5th, 4th, and 3rd to where you have that eighth note completing beat 2 after that dotted quarter note. So some more interest in the rhythm there. That leaps up a 4th to a 5th, where 4ths don't actually have to be recovered, but it is good to. And you can see this is resolved. 4, 3, dissonant passing tone. 3 is suspended into a 4th, creating a 4/3 suspension. No elaborations there, just plain and simple, creating a nice, slow ending. As that 4th resolves down to a 3rd, that 3rd is then suspended again, creating another 4/3 suspension. It's a little chain of 4/3 suspensions there. Then that 3rd is resolved as a quarter note, because this suspension used a dotted half note. From there, that keeps going down a step, as you can see, all the way from up here. It goes down step, goes down step again, keeps going down step, all the way to this eighth note. We're going to use the dissonant passing tone to go through a 3rd and a 5th to an octave in the last measure. So we can see that's different there. Normally, you end on the same note value as the note that you're working against. So if we're working against whole notes here in a 4/4 time, we're going to be ending on a whole note most of the time. This doesn't. This ends on 2 eighth notes, a quarter note, and then a half note. So that definitely adds to a different sort of ending there, but I did this to see what it would sound like. And I'll tell you that I actually like how it sounded, and not because of how it sounds by itself, because I kept playing this, and this led into my next response, which then it created this very interesting effect where this kind of softly resolved this almost without your ears realizing this was completely resolved, using the eighth notes and such, but still doing the octave and still showing you that tonic chord, but it's not a strong resolution, it's sort of soft. That led into the next key, which is the F major response, which if you think about D and F, that's a minor third apart, so that's a little weird there, and it kind of creates a clashing sound of the two harmonies. And with that, I heard that, and I thought what would happen if I put that into violin, made it kind of like a song, and I started experimenting just as fun, and I ended up writing a song with it. So that's why it's always good to experiment and try new things out, because it actually led me up to creating a piece from it, basically. So I'll show you some of that at the end, show you how I started putting this into violin, and then what I did from there. So here's the next response in F major. You can see my note. I wanted to remember that I used this. And you can see the given melody again is in the bass range, in the bass clef. And the response is in the treble clef in the soprano range. It's not starting on beat 1 a lot. Not only does it help with the counterpoint to where you're not just starting both them on the same beat, but it also sometimes helps you with the interval that you want to create. Of course, I could have done a whole note here and done an octave, but it's probably a little more interesting to start on beat 3. So one thing to pay attention to is the first two measures. We can see the given melodies going up a step, and we can see the counterpoints traveling down. So we can see that overall contrary motion, something that's also really good to help with the voice leading. And of course, it just sounds good almost always. The octave goes to a fifth. That's something you may not want, you may not shoot for, but we can see in fact it's traveling in contrary motion, so perfectly fine. And writing octaves to fifths and fifths to octaves when you're able to can actually be a good thing, because octave and fifth is not a sound that you're going to have a lot, something you're going to avoid in many circumstances. But when you can do it, now you're going to be using two different intervals that you're not going to be using very often. The fifth then goes down 2 steps, where it's 2 quarter notes with a dissonant passing tone on beat 3. This goes up a step to a half note in the next measure, creating a third, to where then it goes down a step and up a step using 2 quarter notes, creating that dissonant neighboring tone. So we can see a whole lot of thirds around this area, and I would say thirds and sixths are the 2 intervals that I think sound the best. If you're going to use any interval a lot, and you're going to be doing a bunch of any interval, I think thirds and sixths sound the best, even when you're doing counterpoint. If you're doing third, 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 or sixth, 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 you can very easily hear the 2 notes creating the interval. So it's not like you're getting lost, where if you have a fifth and an octave repeating a bunch, an untrained listener might not be able to hear the 2 notes very well, if not a trained listener. Then that goes up a step, and it continues to go up steps using 2 quarter notes, ending on a half note of that measure on beat 3, another dissonant passing tone of a fourth. The 5 is suspended, creating a 7th on the next measure, where normally you would resolve that dissonance on beat 3 by going down a step, but as you can see, it didn't quite do that. But it did play off that, and it still resolved it down a step. So what it did is it resolved it down a step on beat 2, and then went down 1 more step using stepwise motion to a 5th. So it didn't resolve on beat 3, and it did resolve on beat 2, but using that stepwise motion to lead you into the 5th to where it's going down from there, it's almost like it's still resolving. Because oftentimes when you're resolving something, you're going to go down a step, or you could even go down a few steps. And in this case, we're just resolving down 2 steps, ending on that 5th, which then prepares us for another suspension, which then goes into the next measure, creating a 2nd, because we can see that the given melody is leaping up a 4th here. So this is a perfect moment for creating a suspension, because as this note is suspending and staying the same note, the given melody is leaping up a 4th. So oftentimes with the faster melody up on top, you're going to hear that stick out a lot more, and this enables the given melody to have a chance to stick out more on the bottom, also being that lower voice that isn't heard so well, and of course just adding more to the voice leading properties. The 2nd suspension then should resolve on beat 3, down a step, and we can see it does, and we can see it's embellished to where it's using the reverse embellishment, basically to where it's going down, up, and then down. And then from that resolved unison, it's going up 2 more steps with 8th notes to a 2nd and a 3rd. So doing a dissonant 2nd to a unison is not your best choice of suspension, especially if you're thinking about voice leading with that unison. But in this case, with the faster note values of the eighth notes, it actually allows it to stick out more, and it sounds just fine. I'll let you listen to all these at the end, see what you think of them, and then I'll give you a glimpse on how I started making this more musical, which I'll have another separate video talking about that. How to make your cantus firmus and response more musical in an actual song, where I will teach you how to write a cantus firmus, and then write your given melody. And then with that, you've already been taught how to write counterpoint above that with these videos. So now you're going to be able to create your own basis for a song doing that. And then I'll show you from that basis of the song how I start to play around with it a little bit and make it more musical. Which can even be as simple as taking the bass idea here and adding more notes, creating some chords. Because we're justifying chords here, but just using 2 intervals, we're not really ever creating a full chord without having the 3rd or 5th of the chord, which without having all those put together, you're not sure at this point whether your intervals or your chords are minor or major, except for when you're just comparing to how they would fit in the scale that you're using, but it's the fact that you don't have all the notes making up the chord yet. And after my invertible counterpoint video, I'm going to have a counterpoint video on triads, and then one on 7th chords, so 3 voices and then 4 voices. And with that, you'll have a lot more of an idea on what notes to fill in, how, and why, and then the relationship between notes, what notes to go from one note to the other note, how to approach those notes, as well as I also have some other videos. I'll link a counterpoint playlist, you'll find the videos in there, to where I talk about some general voice leading rules when you're using 4-part harmony, where I talk about what notes you're going to want to double if you're creating, say, triads using 4 voices, what notes then you're not going to want to double, certain tendency tones. Certain tones have a tendency to move up or down a step or a tendency to do something, as well as hidden octaves and fifths. So you'll find all that in those videos. Okay, so we have the suspension and the embellishment to the resolution. That's a unison, but again with those faster notes, sounds perfectly fine, still sticks out. And then the 3rd leaps up a 5th to an octave. So it sounds weird saying leaping up a 5th to an octave, and you might say, wait, is there something wrong with leaping up a 5th to an octave? You're going up a 5th. Well, no, that doesn't matter, because the reason why you wouldn't want a 5th going to an octave, unless you're doing contrary motion, is because your octave is your first overtone of your overtone series above your fundamental note, and your 5th is your second overtone. So with that, you're using the very first 2 overtones right next to each other, let's say if you're doing direct motion, and that's why you want to avoid stuff like that. In this case, leaping up a 5th to an octave is no big deal, because you're leaping up a 5th from one note to another. That's just what you're leaping. You're not using the note of a 5th, you're not using the interval of a 5th, okay? And because of that, the 5th is just allowing you to go a 5th apart from one note to another note, and that distance isn't a big deal. Because if you're going from a 2nd, let's say up a 5th to a 6th, you can see that the 5th gap is just how you get to the 6th. It's not a note that's being sounded, basically. So that's why it's totally fine. So we can see the octave is the high point. Let's pay attention to what note the high point is. We're looking at a C. If we're looking at F major, that is the 5th degree of F major, and therefore it's a very stable scale degree, and it's also a consonant leap away from the tonic note. Doing these creates a very nice high point that you can work with. It sounds very musical, and if you start to create variations and start to vary this, and you have this basic idea, then you have a very solid foundation for something that leads up to a nice high point, and then goes away from that, and it's all solved harmonically already for you, and you can just do more from this basic idea. You could even shorten some lengths of notes. So instead of going from a 8th to a 7th to a 6th to a 5th, you could just delete all that and you just go from an 8th to a 5th. Of course, saying that is probably something you wouldn't want to do, but it's just the fact that you can do stuff like that when you start to edit your piece. Okay, moving on. We see that the high point resolves down. It goes to the 5th, which then that is actually suspended. The G goes to the next measure into a quarter note, as a 7th. So that should be resolved on beat 3. And you can see beat 3, it's resolved down a step. Same embellishment that I keep doing. It goes up from the 7th an octave, back down to the suspended 7th note, down to a 6th, down to a 5th with quarter notes, leading down 2 more steps with 2 more quarter notes, creating a 3rd in the next measure, and then going down to a 2nd, which then goes up to a half note to another 3rd, so that 2nd is justified as a neighboring tone. Then the 3 is suspended, creating a 4th in the next measure, where we can see that is resolved on beat 3 with an elaboration of the suspension with 2 eighth notes. That 3 is suspended again, creating another 4th suspension, which is again resolved down a step to a 3rd. Then now that we're writing above, the 3rd leaps up a 5th to the last note, the tonic. So looking at the notes that we have a G on the bottom and we have a B above that. So thinking about the actual chord, that would be chord 2. And we can see that the bottom note goes down a step to the last note, the tonic. We can see the top note, the B, is leaping up a 5th. So B is actually the 4th scale degree of F major. So it wouldn't be a plagal cadence because you're not using a 4th degree from the root on the bottom, but just the note that you're using is the 4th degree going to the tonic. So it's a sort of 2-1 cadence.